The ubiquitous large herbivores present across the various biomes of the Monster Hunter world can often go ignored by many, but they're key components of any functioning ecosystem. As both fertilizers and food, as well as having their own social systems and unique behaviors, a look into the forgotten monsters can perhaps tell us more about the overall world. Two questions often arise specifically with the herbivores of Monster Hunter, or at least in my experience. One, how is there so many of just a certain few species? And two, how do they even survive in a land full of predatory wyverns? Let's start with that first point. And this one is really as simple as the knowledge that very uneven numbers of different herbivores in a guild are actually quite common. In much of southern Africa, impala significantly outnumber other herbivores, and in eastern African systems like the Serengeti Mara, wildebeest outnumber the next most numerous herbivore 6 times over. In the rest of Africa, it's also not uncommon to see a single herbivore dominating the ecosystem. Of other wild herbivores, capybara are the most numerous in the various South American wetlands, as cheetal deer are often across much of India. So in the world of Monster Hunter, it's not so outlandish that there can be such numerical biases for Aptonoth and other large herbivores. But what are some of the factors that may allow them to reach such numbers? Two of the main factors are likely feeding and breeding. To focus primarily on Aptonoth, it seems likely that they're what we'd call the creative name of mixed feeders. This is to say that they're not specific browsers or grazers, but rather they consume both leaves and branches off trees, as well as grasses, ferns and some gymnosperms on the ground. And this is a very real key to success. The impala manages to be the most successful herbivore across much of southern Africa due to this breadth of diet. Other highly successful herbivores only reach similar densities because of both migratory habits coinciding with the ecosystems they live in, effectively being tailor-made for them. Impala really just need vegetation and water, and then they're capable of living at good numbers anywhere with them, and haven't changed for 5 million years. Hadrosaurs were likely somewhat similar as mixed feeders. Originally thought of as horsetail and fern grazers, hadrosaur diet is now known to be much more extensive. They likely browsed trees as well, and could do so with a broad feeding height range due to them being able to rear up. And they even had the mouths and stomachs to deal with rotting wood and the banquet of fungi and crustaceans it held. This allowed them to be a widespread and successful family. Aptonoth are likely the same in this regard, and it's the best explanation for their quite incredible range. From desert fringes in the sandy plains to dense rainforests to the seasonal foothills of the snowy mountains, Aptonoth can live just about anywhere it seems, switching from grazing to browsing depending on the environment and being able to process a wide range of plants. Their only real limitations seem to be water availability that prevents them from persisting in true desert areas, and a lack of adaptations for xerophytic plants that prevent further desert colonization, but also of volcanic regions too. Other than that and true tundra areas, Aptonoth remain the most common herbivore over much of the Old World, and retain a strong foothold in the New World too. On the other end of the spectrum, Apceros, Popo and Slagtoth likely thrive so well by feeding on the vegetation in extreme environments Aptonoth can't handle. And in the case of Apceros, possibly other desert herbivores too. Desert-adapted herbivores will browse a very wide variety of plants, making long journeys along select routes for different species. Some of these plants will often have noticeable anti-predator mechanisms. Cacti have spines, and euphorbias have a thick, milky latex that's poisonous and severely irritates the skin and eyes. Animals like black rhino show little concern of such defences, and can readily feed on such unpleasant plants. Whilst Diablos may monopolise cacti, and Monoblos can feed on more woody vegetation, Apceros may partially escape competition with giant bloss wyverns by feeding on poisonous vegetation unpalatable to others. Whilst Apceros and many other desert animals will drink when they get the chance, they may also use similarly unpalatable material for water as well, chewing it for the moisture contents but not eating it in favour of better quality browse. When possible, Apceros may still take the easy option though. The rich flowering plants in the marshes of the Wildspire Waste likely allow great numbers of Apceros to live at the highest densities of anywhere in the known world due to the abundance of food and water from the springs. Popo may actually be one of the more selective of the monster hunter herbivores. Their low-hanging head and humped shoulder suggest that they're grazers, or at very least eat relatively low-lying plants. This fits with much of what is believed about woolly mammoths and many Ice Age mega-herbivores, that they primarily fed on grass and sedges. It's possible their diet may have been more varied in certain times and places though, with trees and herbs found in mammoth remains as well. In a similar way to Aptonoth, it may be possible Popo have weathered periods of climate change that threaten the boreal regions they live in, by being more generalist than other herbivores there. Whilst they seem to have a much more limited browse range, it still seems likely that they can eat a myriad of plants within a certain height range, certainly enough to exploit the shrubs and lower branches of various trees in the cold evergreen forests. Finally, with Slagtoth, despite their outward resemblance to hippopotamus, they may actually be more analogous to a sort of terrestrial manatee or dugong. Hippos are dependent on water or mud to keep their skin moisturized, but they rarely feed on aquatic vegetation, instead leaving the water bodies to graze extensively on terrestrial plants. From the environments we find Slagtoth in, there is little in the way of palatable grasses nearby. In fact, in the volcanoes there rarely appears to be much in the way of edible plant life full stop. This suggests the bulk of their food comes mainly from the water itself. And this actually puts a lot of constraint on Slagtoth as a species. Unlike manatees, they can't just bob along the bottom grazing for large periods, as they're almost certainly considerably worse at swimming. Both the physiology of Slagtoth and the structure of aquatic plants will limit their abundance to rivers and wetland areas of a certain depth, where they can actually access edible plant mass and surface regularly without burning too many calories. Slagtoth do seem to have muscular, mobile lips, and these may be of great use in uprooting below-ground parts of plants that can often have the most calories in, as dugongs and manatees often do with their similarly strong mouth parts. Slagtoth may have similar effects on aquatic ecosystems as other herbivores do on terrestrial ones, and may have a slew of pros and cons for other life there. Slagtoth may modify the diversity and biomass of other plants, changing the situation for other aquatic herbivores like Epioth. It may improve things for them too. Slagtoth overgrazing may result in fewer places for things like Gobel to hide, reducing predation rates. So, animals don't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes the success of one species can benefit another, or multiple species, but sometimes it can doom them. It's been suggested the success of hadrosaurs may have led to declines in the diversity of other herbivorous dinosaurs throughout the Cretaceous, better utilising their resources as well as being able to acquire others they couldn't. The great success of herbivores like Aptonoth in some areas may account for the lack of other species. The Aptonoth may be the winners at the finishing line of a very long evolutionary race. Modern herbivores can also clue us into some ways success in one species can doom another. Rowan antelope aren't especially common in much of southern Africa, and they prefer areas of open scrubby woodland on infertile soils, with little competition. Whilst capable of defending themselves fiercely, they're not really used to high densities of predators either. In the Kruger National Park, a program to increase game numbers created a lot of man-made boreholes in the park to supply herbivores with more water. This led to influxes in some areas of certain species like zebra or wildebeest that naturally lived at low densities there, and then large numbers of lions followed their prey. For the rowan that lived in these areas, this increase in lion numbers caused a sharp increase in predation on them that was severe enough it led to a significant decline in population. Management actions managed to halt this before localized extinction, and began processes to reverse it. But it clearly shows how changes in environment, herbivore numbers and predation can severely affect animals not adapted to it. Throughout the ancient forest there are various bones and old skeletons that don't appear to be from any species we see in game. If you watch the Puki Puki video, it seems possible that Rathalos's arrival in the ancient forest some time ago may have had significant impacts on it, changing it from a deep forest into a more open mosaic of trees and plains. This in turn likely led to far greater numbers of Aptonoth due to better forage quality, and in turn greater numbers of Anjanath and Rathalos to feed on them. This increase in both competition and predation may have even driven some of the herbivores or other animals to extinction. These animals were likely better adapted to the original dense forest, and both lower numbers and diversity of predators, but now they only last as ancient fossils in the forest. But of course, Aptonoth themselves are far from immune to getting eaten. So what are some of the ways Aptonoth handle themselves in a world full of predators? For one, it may be possible that they can replenish deceased individuals relatively quickly by being prolific breeders. When you live in big herds and all breed at the same time, you can achieve predator swamping. This is when you flood the environment with so many young at the same time that there's too many for the predators to eat. Whilst we don't know how large a clutch of Aptonoth eggs are, even if we assume it's something like between 10 and 20, then for how big the herds are, that's still a lot of offspring. Even if there's an even sex ratio in herds, which isn't likely, that's still hundreds of hatchlings at a time. And on top of that, the babies aren't a guaranteed meal either. Against smaller predators like the pack-hunting bird wyverns, mother Aptonoth defend their offspring fiercely. If Aptonoth group together in nest sites when the young are still very small, actually managing to grab one isn't going to be easy, even for a pack working in concert. Baby Aptonoth also probably don't stay very small for very long. Hadrosaurs grew and matured very fast. It's another of the reasons they were so successful. They were already quite large by a year old, and by 2 or 3 years old they were able to reproduce themselves. If Aptonoth breed yearly and are sexually mature in a few years, large herds will easily be able to replenish their losses per annum, and young animals will quickly become large enough to become immune to smaller predators at least. It's worth noting as well that there are different types of predation and different types of predator. Additive predation is any mortality that takes directly from the population and lowers overall survival. Compensatory predation is a mortality that occurs to an animal that was already unlikely to survive anyway, sometimes called the doomed surplus. Examples include old or sick animals. Cursorial predators are one that capture their prey by running it down after selecting an individual and causing flight, whereas ambush predators use the element of surprise to take their prey unawares. These two hunting styles select for different weaknesses. Coursing predators are more likely to take physically deficient animals as these will lag behind in the chase. Ambush predators are much more likely to exploit behavioural deficiencies in animals, ones that have chosen habitats that really stack the odds in the predator's favour. Most large wyverns are likely ambush predators, using flight or the environment to conceal themselves before a lunge, whereas most raptorial bird wyverns are likely cursors, harassing or spooking their prey into fleeing before picking the easiest target. These aren't set rules. Cursors will still take healthy prey regularly if there aren't easier targets, and stalkers will still take physically deficient animals if the opportunity presents. When we apply all of this to Monster Hunter, the most frequent predation is likely cursorial from the bird wyverns due to how much more common they'll be. Most of the adults taken will be from them cropping the physically deficient ones from the herd, and these will be the ones least useful for reproduction. Considering how large the territories of predatory flying or brute wyverns are, each one will likely encompass several large Aptonoth herds. So whilst Rathalos may inflict additive mortality on the herds, it's going to be relatively minor for the overall population. It's often wondered how Aptonoth can even survive, but with their sheer numbers, the actual risk to each individual Aptonoth is relatively low each time a Rathalos flies out to hunt, even if most mortality is still from predation. Consider too that for healthy adults the overall risk of predation drops even further, and it's clear Aptonoth aren't poorly equipped for the world at all. Many deer or antelope species defend themselves relatively poorly in a fight, and instead rely on fleeing and numbers as their main defense. And remember that outside of gameplay, Aptonoth are still canonically quite fast as well, capable to keep up a high speed for a decent period of time. Apceros, on the other hand, may not be quite so fecund with their breeding, and if the size of their eggs are anything to go by, they likely have smaller clutches that they guard fiercely and hatch into reasonably precocial chicks. Apceros can probably take this different strategy as they live in a much poorer environment. The fact the hunter is employed to zero in on the monsters can give an inflated idea of their density. And in deserts, even things like gen prey probably traverse over huge areas in search of food. With less risk of predation, Apceros can put more of their eggs in one basket, so to speak, and likely have longer gestations, slower growth, and older maturity. In terms of defense, they're far slower but much better armed. Whilst for gameplay purposes they're obviously just cannon fodder, the thick shell and hide seem to provide good protection from bites, and gen prey may well have developed their neurotoxic venom to try and even the playing field. When threatened by large wyverns, Apceros form a defensive triangle, each club covering the head of another animal, and so leaving no weak links in a chain, just as real herbivores will form pinwheels with the weapons on the outside. Anything willing to break this has to contend with a tough shell or spiked clubs, and presumably Apceros will keep young safe in the centre once hatched as well. Habitat selection can also impact predation risk, and this may be one of the key features of how Popo manage the guild of Palearctic predators they have to live with. Bison will change their group sizes dependent on the environment they're in, gathering in larger social groups in open meadows, and splitting into smaller ones when entering woodland. Smaller groups are harder to detect, and the forests are safer than the open meadows wolves prefer to hunt in, so the bison are grouping up for more safety. In Popo, when encountered in the lower-lying forests, they're often seen in small groups, often 3, that may be parents and a calf. In cutscenes of them in the higher mountain passes, the group sizes are often a lot larger, and it seems small Popo groups may fusion into larger ones to traverse the open mountain trails for the greater vigilance a group will bring. These areas are very high-risk environments for Popo. They're typically trapped against the mountain on one side and a sheer drop on the other. The canyons and cliffs also provide tigrex with plenty of spots to ambush. It makes sense to have more eyes with you when making these journeys. In contrast, the forest likely works in the Popo's favour. Tigrex may be swift in a straight-line charge, and likely faster than Popo, but it's probably the least agile pseudo-wyvern. Popo can likely turn and manoeuvre faster. In its Ecology video, the targeted Popo even managed to throw off the Tigrex temporarily by jinking in the chase. On top of this, the trees will also provide the larger, broader Tigrex with obstacles it'll struggle to move around in time, whereas the smaller, more narrow Popo can likely weave between them. On top of this, whilst forests do give good cover for a massive animal like Tigrex, they can also blow it. And in real predators, hunting in thick vegetation can conceal prey or spoil hunts. Most Tigrex hunts on Popo in the boreal forests probably end in failure, whereas most hunts in the mountains or open steppes and tundra likely end in success. So in these environments, Popo will group together for vigilance and safety. This type of sociality is called fission fusion, essentially the behaviour of animals that form groups and then split apart again. It's common across multiple taxa, and is also seen in elephants. Assorted herds will gather in social arenas to maintain social bonds and exchange information about migration routes or waterholes or other such worthwhile ecological knowledge. Maybe Popo do something similar. If related to elephants or monster hunters' elephant equivalents, then they have quite odd social systems. From the descriptions of males protecting the young and Popo groups often being 2 adults and a calf, it seems they may live in small nuclear families. These families may occasionally come together in social arenas, at good grazing spots or on dangerous journeys, so the combined knowledge exchanged helps the greater group. It also has interesting connotations for their relationship with Gammoth. If this is the case, Gammoth calves fostered with Popo may not just be fostered with a herd, but rather take to a specific Popo family almost like an adoptive family. Gammoth's hatred of Tigrex thus may not just be of all Tigrex, but especially of individual Tigrex that have predated their adoptive families. This also may be why Gammoth are so aggressive to hunters on sight. Considering how often humans hunt Popo for food and fur, it's likely humans and hunters themselves occasionally also slay Gammoth's family. But just as some herbivores have plentiful behavioural traits to keep them safe, Surprisingly, there are a number that can render them equally vulnerable as well. Slagtoth are often described as heavily territorial, to the point where males often won't flee from hunting wyverns. For male herbivores especially, territoriality can hamstring escape from predators. Some antelope species are described as unwilling to leave their territories when pursued by cursorial predators, often getting intercepted and eaten. Similar vulnerability seems present in cervid species in Eurasia. And in many samples of predator-caused mortality, a bias towards males in the adult class isn't uncommon. As well as territorial behaviour, males just may accept the risks in getting to the reward of more nutritious forage. Cape buffalo bulls have a risk of predation that's almost 4 times greater than that of cows, due to the smaller groups and spending more time in thick areas that lions like to hunt in. The reward is that they have equal or better quality food here and have to travel far less to get it, allowing them to make gains in body size or to become dominant in breeding herds for great reproductive success. This also may be one reason Slagtoth are so territorial to begin with. Slagtoth openly wear their health on their sleeve, with the hanging folds of fatty skin being honest indicators of their condition. A male with a good territory full of nutritious forage can advertise his strength for all to see, and likely results in better reproductive success. Fail to reproduce, and for a male animal, you've effectively failed at the whole thing you were alive to try and do. It's so important to them to be worth risking death for. So to give my thoughts on the herbivores, there's not really much you can say in regards to fight or gear. Although who can deny the usefulness of medium and large monster bones? In terms of design and whatnot, they're all pretty good, and it's surprising how iconic they can feel for just what are modified dinosaurs a lot of the time. I think my favourite is probably the Popo. They're just very cute and yet very monster hunter at the same time. Despite all the points I made supporting the relatively low herbivore diversity, I do hope their guild will be fleshed out in the future games, especially with new areas and maybe some larger ones like Aptonoth for the more massive carnivores. Endemic life and small monsters can be very important for making the game world feel more alive. Similarly, the relationships between predators and prey would be great to build on, with more, better and more variable animations and different responses to different predators. Probably a lot to ask, but a man can dream. And to you, thanks for watching. There was a lot of great discussion from Goss's video last week. In terms of possible usage of the ice blades, quite a few of you, including Zezix, Marbled Frog and Regular Brook Studios, suggested they may be important for food processing. Considering Goss's very reduced cheek teeth, which is where most mammals process the hard food outside of rodents, this does fit quite nicely. In the frozen winter, they'll need to utilise as much food on the carcass as possible, including bone, and can use the ice weapons to help completely dismember frozen carcasses killed by winter, or other animals found opportunistically too. In the warmer summer months, this becomes less important as there's a much greater prey availability and carcasses won't freeze, so Goss wouldn't be impeded by not being able to make its ice blades in the warmer weather. It's also quite interesting as some of the first stone tools our ancestors ever created were also to help butcher carcasses. Goss may be even approaching the Stone Age. Or I guess in his case it's still the Ice Age? Who knows, give them 1,000,000 years or so and they may have become some All Tomorrow's Monster Hunter crossover of the Bone Crushers and Goss Harag. Another use suggested by a few of you was intraspecific combat between the Goss Harag themselves, especially between males competing for females. This was one idea I also had, but I was a little hesitant to commit to it without any knowledge of sexual dimorphism in them. But it's still not a bad idea. Carrying a giant ice blade on your arm is a good indicator of fitness in a frigid environment, and it could also be used between both genders in general disputes over resources, allowing fighting that indicates a clear winner but without killing your opponent that could potentially be a viable mate later in the season. Freaky Owl also suggested self-anointing with ice may be a way to kill off parasites nestled in the warm fur of Goss Harag, much like how severe mange infections can often die off in the cold of winter. Regarding hibernation, one thing quite a few of you suggested was the possibility that it could render Goss quite vulnerable to predation by a lot of the Frost Island wyverns. This is reflected in real-world bears, who can often be taken by other bears, wolves or tigers in torpor. but it doesn't seem to be severe enough to have much of an evolutionary prompt for them to change things, although it could well be a contributing factor. A few also rightly added that male polar bears don't hibernate, and whilst I was a bit hesitant to use polar bears for comparisons as they're quite specialised as marine animals, it is interesting that a lot of the physiological conditions in hibernation also occur in polar bears, albeit when they fast, so evolutionary leftovers may still be present in GOS to help it weather exceptionally harsh periods. All in all, there was a lot of good ideas, and sorry to anyone's name who I missed, but I really do recommend giving the comments a read through. In response to the community post, I definitely should have made it clearer I was more intending a less serious, more off-topic video than another non-Monster Hunter analysis of something. But that said, all the suggestions for future videos are appreciated, and at least some of you seemed keen for a Q&A, so let's go ahead with that. The Pokesaurus also came up with the good idea of me doing quick overviews of assorted media I'm often asked about, be it TV, film, games, or other stuff. The list of things I plan to cover is still quite long, so even if I took every request made to me right now, your favourite IP may still be some weeks away. And this struck me as a good idea of at least giving some input to the things I'm often asked about. So I've made another community post. Here you can post both general questions for the Q&A, be it about the channel, Monster Hunter, Primal, Kong, actual animals, dinosaurs, popular culture, whatever. Anything really, and also what are my thoughts on X. So you can ask for views on various fictional properties you enjoy yourself. The next video might be a while, I'm anticipating it to be around an hour give or take, and it's another video I personally wanted to do. Like the Jurassic Park one, it's more of a commentary than an analysis, so here's the quite obvious teaser.